I received a letter from someone, actually a former Muslim who's evidently converted to Judaism, and his question was about the authorship of the Torah. He said he wanted to know whether or not we believed in the documentary hypothesis, and if so, which is the theory that many people wrote the Torah, it wasn't written all from God to Moses at Sinai, and if that's true, then what does that do about the rest of Jewish tradition? So I answered in the following way. I told him a story about when I was a sophomore in college at the University of Chicago, and I signed up for a course. I was majoring in religion. I signed up for a course in the divinity school, and it was taught by a German Presbyterian Old Testament professor named J. Wilcox, and I took it because I thought I knew the Bible would be an easy A. I had basically an Orthodox education until that point. I never heard of the documentary hypothesis. Well, the class was full of graduate students in divinity, and when I went into the class, this professor is talking for the first 15 minutes about what everybody else in the class knew but me, which is his starting assumption that the 5 books of Moses, that we call the Torah, consisted of several different documents written over many hundreds of years and redacted much later on, about 500, 800 years after Moses, and that's what the Torah was. Well, I was totally shaken. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So immediately after class, I ran to the local synagogue where I was the youth director, and it happened to house an Orthodox day school that I had attended as a kid. So I bumped into the principal, who was an Orthodox rabbi, and asked him what I heard, and he said, oh, that was all anti-Semitism. It wasn't true. Of course, the Torah was written from Moses to Sinai, at Sinai. So I said, well, doesn't the Talmud say actually that the last 8 verses were written by Joshua because Moses is dead? And he said, oh, that's one view. And I said, well, could it have been 9 verses? And could it have been, more than the 40 years in the desert? Because I knew that the most liberal Orthodox view was that it was written during the 40 years in the desert. He said, no. So then I went up to see, just in case that wasn't the only view in Judaism, I went up to see the conservative rabbi of the synagogue. This is a wonderful rabbi, and Ralph Simon, who's no longer alive, sadly. And he told me that what I had heard in college from Professor Wilcoxon was basically the starting assumption of the faculty of the Jewish Theological Seminary. They had some differences, but basically that was true. So I said, well then, what does that do about the rest of Judaism? And he gave me a lot of books to read, and basically said that the Torah itself is not a word-for-word record of what God said, and it was oral for hundreds of years, and there are so many problems in the text. For example, just read Genesis chapter 1, and compare it carefully to Genesis chapter 2, and you see that it's contradictory in how it's organized, and they have different names for God in those 2 texts, and hundreds of examples like that. So it's more of a midrash on what God said to Moses and what our ancestors understood. It doesn't mean it's not divine, that it's divinely inspired, but it's not a record, like make a tape recording like I'm doing right now. And that is the basic difference between the Orthodox and the fundamentalists and the rest of non-Orthodox and fundamentalist Jews and Christians. A critical point, and I hope satisfactory. It makes it more difficult. It's easier to believe in some ways that if everything is from God directly, then it's clearer. In fact, there's a very famous neo-Orthodox rabbi named Raphael Shimshon Hirsch, and he once said, I read something he wrote, that either it's true that the Torah says God commanded Moses to say blah, 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 or it's not true. If it's true, you have to do it. If it's not, then the whole thing is silly. Well, it's obviously more subtle than that. And discerning people have to carefully read the text and understand how our tradition viewed it and see it as holy. It's the holiest text we have. Believe it's divinely inspired and live our lives on that basis. So it's not as easy as a simple black and white fundamentalist. But on the other hand, it's truer. It's true, and the other is not. And we have to live our lives based on that real consequence.